AM 1280 News Talk KIT, providing news, information, conversation, and the public service of information. Elections, importante, as
That's right.
Jackson always reminds us as he shows off his command of Spanish. And as a result, we have routinely tried to bring the candidates to you, and this election being no different. And I think one of the reasons we've not always covered school board, but this time around with school board issues so much in the headlines and in the news and other places around the country. Hey, thank heavens we're not dealing with the hassle here in Yakima. Pretty good chance we never will. Yeah. But they're out there. They play into an otherwise part of our national narrative. And so there are some questions that are, I think, valid to ask school board candidates. And so that's why we're bringing them in this time. And our first candidate is the challenger in position 1, Kenton Gartrell. Good morning, Kenton.
Good morning, Dave.
Good morning. Lance Tormey, you always kind of start this off and put them in the squeeze and say, tell us about yourself, and don't leave out any of the details.
That's right. We know you're a business owner, Kenton. Welcome to the station. Thanks for coming in. Tell us about yourself. Who are you, and why are you running for the Yakima School Board?
Well, my name is Kenton Gartrell. I've lived here in Yakima practically my whole life. I went off to college for a little time being, and then came back to Yakima, bought a house over on North 6th Street, so live in the inner city area. And that was about 3 years ago, 2.5 years ago. Then I met my wife and got married. My wife is actually from Honduras. She's actually status as a refugee, so I am a mixed household. I have 2 daughters. Also, my one daughter goes to Nob Hill Elementary School. I have a wonderful family, a bilingual family. I speak broken English. My wife speaks broken Spanish, so it works out, and the child figures it out in between. So it's a wonderful thing. But a little bit more about me is I am the owner of Yakima Reclaimed and Patriot Woodworking here downtown Yakima. Started that about a little over 2 years ago, about 6 months before COVID hit. COVID hit, and like anybody else, kind of took a beating on the business, but been surviving and moving on right along. As for why I got into the race of Yakima School District, was at first we were doing a lot of events. We were handing out food at a lot of political events, both conservative and liberal. In particular, one that got me into the race was the BLM movement one. We went out there. We were asked to hand out tacos at that event, and at that event we were passing out tacos. The Herald took a photo of what we were doing out there, and that photo ended up getting into the school district. So when the school district was sitting there telling all us parents that they weren't teaching CRT or anything of the sense, I'm sitting there watching my kid on a Zoom meeting being passed around a picture of the BLM movement in Yakima with my face on the photo. So I was like, well, you say you're not teaching this, but here you are with a photo of me, which is kind of weird, and teaching all the kids this. So that kind of got me going into kind of running, because I was irritated at they were saying one thing but doing another.
Give us a little more detail on, if you would, Kenton. To you, the picture represented what?
Overall, people in political marches is okay. It's part of our society. It's part of our free speech in our American society. But when there's so much violence around it and everything going on that happened for that particular movement that we all saw on TV and everything like that, I don't think it was appropriate to be teaching basically 10-year-olds anything about it. We should be sticking to history as it's written in the educational system, as the facts are, like, our civil wars, our revolutions, the history of our country, and we should stick to the curriculum that we're given, instead of a lot of times we're adding to that curriculum that's not necessarily approved, it's not necessarily true, or we don't have enough information about it. And definitely the BLM movement, all you'd have information-wise was coming from the news, which is clearly where that photo came from.
Well, and what grade was your child in?
Fifth grade.
Fifth grade. Is that too young for current events? Because that's a class that's often taught where we're talking about stuff that's going on today and might go on tomorrow,
To me, if they're doing like more analytical studies, in my schooling career, I could only relate from when I was in elementary
Sure.
or middle school and stuff like that, is we didn't talk about current events till either late middle school or early high school when you're doing civics class specifically and in those kind of
Okay.
courseworks, because you're doing more analytical, you're doing more essay type work, so you're diving in deep versus just reading information and then regurgitating it.
So it's a matter of appropriate audience as much as anything in terms
Yeah,
of
and
time period.
and also somebody has to be able to verify that the information is accurate and approved even, because if we just allow anybody to just teach whatever anything within the curriculum, it's not been reviewed, it's not been at least trickled down to the teacher in some kind of process, you could be teaching the wrong thing or an inappropriate thing.
Does that hold up though at the higher grades? I mean, because at some point, I mean, hey, I'm probably twice as old as you are, and I remember current events. That was, that happened to be wagon trains going west to Oregon, and when I was in school, it's like watch the wagon train go by. That was our current event. That's how old I am, but I do remember we still talked about it, but we don't need to press that. But so that's kind of what lit your fire and said, hey, this from your perspective, this is not what we want to be doing, so you're going to at least take a run and see how it goes. All right.
Do you think that all these CRT and BLM? I mean, the next question is that generic. What do you think the school district's biggest challenges are? But do you think all that new information, all these new concepts being brought in, do you believe that's one of the biggest challenges? And if not, what are some of the biggest challenges in the district right now?
So I think the largest challenge that our district faces, and I think other districts within the state of Washington face, is politics. Yeah. Politics within our school system, politics being trickled down from the upper level down to the lower level, and the lower level is expected to just sit there and basically take it, accept it, and do it. And I think that is completely wrong. I am strictly of the campaign that says no to CRT, critical race theory. To be honest, in Yakima, the Yakima School District, it's actually not called CRT. I was in the meeting because when they first started coming back for physical or meetings at Ike versus Zoom, and they actually changed the wording from CRT to equitable studies. It's the same material. It's the same. I forget what you call the individual that teaches all the teachers how to teach it. It's the same. Everything's the same. All they did was change the wording, and to me that's wrong. You're trying to, because it became a hot button issue, all you're trying to do is slip it in there and hopefully everybody goes away, kind of thing. And we live in Yakima, which is a majority conservative as far as voting records go, and we have a board that is literally has no minority on it. So when I say no minority, I mean of the other political party. We currently have a full Democrat list of Yakima School Board, which is unusual, but in the past, Republicans and conservatives have ignored the lower portions of politics. They usually stick to the higher realms. And this year, like Dave mentioned earlier, is that there's a large focus on school districts, and it's because I think Republicans have learned you can't ignore culture and you can't ignore your educational systems any longer, because at some point those kids become college kids, or at some point they get into the upper high school realm and they get involved in politics, even if they can't vote. One America uses a lot of kids in their doorbelling, in their volunteers. Sometimes they're the age of 16. Those aren't voters, but they go around door to door because who's going to slam the door on a kid? Let's be honest.
So, do you agree with statements that have been made by others that progressive Democrats have co-opted education in America in general? That there's more the strength of teachers' unions and that sort of thing. Do you feel that it is you want to get politics out? Great. Do you feel that politics is as overwhelming and from the left as a lot of other critics have said? Do you feel that same way? Or?
Like that is heavily inside of the school district?
Totally influenced by the left.
Yes, 100%. Because conservatives tend to be more isolationist or protectionist. They tend to leave others alone. They don't like to, I'm a libertarian, first off. So what you do in your own house is what you do, as long as it doesn't affect the rights or the safety of another. And a lot of conservatives have the same mindset. If you leave me alone, I'll leave you kind of alone. And so they've always treated it that way. Whereas liberals or Marxists, because we're dealing with a more radical element now than in the past decade. Marxists, like, look at Nancy Pelosi in the news. She's having trouble keeping control of that more radical realm now, whereas 10 years ago, that was you could ignore it. You can't do that anymore because they're prevalent. The younger ages are pushing it. We just had BLM in all of these major cities doing the same thing, which comes from that radical side.
Mm-hmm.
And it's happening in the school districts, and they're kowtowing. The squeaky wheel gets the oil, and that's what's happening right now. And for instance, a couple days, or actually on Monday, is the union for Yakima School District, which is called Yakima Educational Association. The president actually sends out an email to all of his union members, which is in the Yakima School District, saying don't vote for Kenton Gartrell. So if they're not involved heavily in politics, why would they be sending out a generalized email using school emails to do that?
Interesting. So I guess in a way, if they're all the same, you'd be the one doing the squeaking then if you get on, right?
I'd be the
Yeah.
You're
so
prepared to squeak? Is that what you're saying?
and I'll say this if Ryan Beckett gets in there, if I myself get in there, we tend to be more conservative leaning. We will be, for the first time in a very long time, conservatives on the Yakima School Board. We will literally it's unfortunate, we will make up the minority first off, because it's a 5-panel board, so we'll win. If we win 2 positions, we become 2. So we become the minority, but at least you get a voice and maybe a few table poundings in there.
All right. Kenton Gartrell, our guest this morning and candidate for position 1 Yakima School Board. Kenton, procedurally, we take a break. Lance does news. We take a quick look at the forecast, then we'll come back and pick up our conversations. Our conversation continues with Kenton Gartrell. Kenton is a candidate for school board, and I guess for a lot of folks, we wonder, what does a school board director do? So let's, as we pick back up the conversation, Kenton, we're going to put that before you. What exactly, in your interpretation, is the job of a school board director? You don't get to go in and wave a yardstick at kids or anything like that. So what does it mean to you?
So after observing a lot of their meetings, both online, majority-wise, and in person, it typically is a top-down ladder pyramid. So you have policy making, you have budget. They deal a lot in budget, and again in policy making. So either they're auditing a lot of sectors, or they're creating policy, or looking over policy to add curriculum, change curriculum, or maybe there's a staffing issue that has to be addressed, particularly. So they're more administrative in that regard.
Okay. So if you had a concern for appropriateness of curriculum, and that's kind of what lit the fire under you, how are you able to bring that to the group and generate effective change or nudge or modification or whatever, given the makeup of what is mostly an administrative type board? I mean, not any. I mean, do you have? How do I say this? I'll let you answer that one first, and I got a follow-up question for you too.
So it's going to take a team to do something, because obviously you have to have a vote of 3. The other thing is working with the superintendent. You have to have a decent working relationship with the superintendent, because he's the one that he's the arm that enforces.
He's like the city manager of a city council system, right?
Correct.
Kind of in a way.
So it's working with him heavily. The other thing is auditing, and there's 2 types of auditing. You have your financial and budgeting auditing, and you have your curriculum auditing, or your policy audit. So how does this get implemented? How has it been implemented? And what exactly is the reaction of where it's getting implemented? So you have to audit in 2 different ways. First, you want to know where the money's going, and then, because some things just, maybe it's a funding issue. Other things, maybe it needs to be defunded, and that way it goes away naturally. You don't have to deal with it too much. Or you have to get everybody together, and the superintendent is more trained in consistency and experienced in that realm. So he's going to him and using his knowledge of, we want to do something different, and we got elected to do something different. We want to move towards this. How can we implement this, and how can we do this in a calm, a cohesive unit versus a lot of fighting? Because as you notice with city council, a lot of fighting doesn't get very far.
No, it doesn't. Been there, done that. Okay, so Lance, I didn't mean to.
No, I'm sorry, and I don't. Yeah, you know, Kenton. When I Google your name, I'm coming up with all kinds of stuff.
Yes.
So I think you got it. I think because others are going to do the same thing.
Yes.
And I think you got to address all the controversy that I see on the page. Your association with Jason White. I mean, let's just cut to it. Address that. Address the problems that we've seen in the past. Your association with Jason White, because it's kind of like the elephant in the room sometimes.
So Jason White and I opened up a business together a couple years ago, and we were mostly, it was being kept under wraps for the better part of when things were getting friction and stuff like that, because COVID hit. Things became a struggle.
Right.
We did have a great relationship. I would go out to bat for him every so often. And I think with COVID and all the stresses of everything, we slowly started going apart. And when you have to run a business, you have to run a business. And it's sad and unfortunate. Eventually it spilled into the public atmosphere, and I apologize for that, but that wasn't my intention. But obviously there's two parties to the situation. I wish him luck. It's sad. Again, it doesn't help the business. It doesn't help us in any way, shape, or form. But we eventually had to separate, and kind of spilled into the public atmosphere. But he's going to go his way. I'm going to go my way, and that's kind of how it's been.
Well, when it gets, I guess the follow-up to that would be basically you have fought with me, sir. When you consider the job of kids in school is to show up, turn up, and learn, and someone who in a previous life went to bat for somebody who wasn't showing up, I think that there will be voters that will have that question about then how do they jump from one to the other.
So in the regards of that exact subject of showing up, I did early on support him in what he was doing, because I thought his cause was right. He wanted the public to be there to speak. He wanted the public to be able to speak. And I ran into that trying to speak at City Council when they were in Zoom format. At first, they didn't have a format. They didn't have a format.
Absolutely.
And when they did have a format, they ended up regulating all the questions, where before they weren't doing that. So they completely changed the format. So they said, oh, yeah, we're going to let you do this, but you got to email at such time. But they regulated all the questions. Like, I wanted to ask about a certain thing within one of the departments, which involved eventually the climate, whatever they're doing with climate change,
Right.
or whatever.
Safe
City Act
change
thing.
yeah.
And I couldn't get the question in because it wasn't on their agenda. But it was on their next agenda. And so they were regulating that heavily. So I don't think that's right. I don't think it's fair. I don't think it's to your constituents at all. It's more or less you're regulating it because you don't want the frustration of being told, oh, maybe this is a bad idea, or maybe this is a good idea. I don't know what the person will say. But I supported him early on in that regard, because I think his heart was in the right place. I think he was doing it for the right thing. But I think as COVID went on, and I think as political pressure goes on, because you do have only two people on the Yakima City Council that are conservative leaning. The rest are all typically liberal leaning, or actually on their registrations as part of the Democrat Party. I firmly don't believe in a nonpartisan race. I don't believe anybody's nonpartisan. I believe we're all humans and we're all imperfect. So we have biases, either growing up through our culture or through our politicals, whatever bias that might be. And to say something's nonpartisan is almost a lie, because you're biased somewhere. You're somewhere.
Sure.
Now you might be more in the middle, and you might cross the aisle every once in a while, or you might have different principles that fall in different places, but you lean somewhere. You vote somewhere in a majority.
Sure.
And I think that's people need to start being honest. And even in my race, I'm honest. If you look in the voters guide, I think 4 times, I'm a Republican. I'm a libertarian that sits in the Republican Party, because I know the two-party system. Obviously, the libertarian's not going to be taken very seriously in the state of Washington. So I sit as a PCO of the Republican Party. And I think Doris should know that. Doris should know where I'm politically most likely to lean.
Sure.
Because that makes my vote at the end of the day, possibly.
Well, I think that sort of upfront honesty is, again, transparent and good for the process, and I would agree.
Yeah.
That's why we've asked every candidate that's come through here. Lance has asked them, you take your politics with you wherever you go. So
Yeah,
how
that's
do you
right.
how do you describe yourself?
Yeah.
And voters need
Like
to know
to
that.
say-
Yeah.
And I'd like to say one more thing. And towards the end of his term, because this is his last year in term in office, is probably about January. I was trying to tell him, you do need to start going back, because we have people that are going to run in the race, specifically 2, 4, and 6, that it's going to affect their race because it could be used against them. And you've made your point. Just start going back, because there's things you have to vote on. There's things you have to show up and start fighting for, because they're taking advantage and they're passing things when nobody could give comment, when nobody could be there. And you're the only way that voice can be heard, because you have the right to be there. You have the right to say no on these issues and to say why you're saying no. And I think towards the end, he was slowly giving up. And I think you saw this on Patricia Byers as well. You kind of see her just going with the motion and stuff. And that's not a negative on her part. When you're two conservatives against a majority that's not going to change their mind and push whatever they want without the public, there's not much you can do other than say no. And it's sad and unfortunate with the city of Yakima. And that's why it's super important in Yakima right now that people realize who the Save the Yakima candidates are, who the conservatives are in Yakima that are going to fight for him. You have Matt Brown in District 6. You have Mark Shervey in District 4. You have Edgar Hernandez in District 2. That I tell the Republican Party, and I've been fighting this for over 2 years in the Republican Party internally, you have a majority of Republicans in the county, but your cities every 4 years have been increasing in Democrat turnout. You have not been increasing Republican turnout unless you want to talk about population growth. And that's not going to win you any battles in the long run.
Yeah, there's been no investment since we did the redistricting and all. That's a whole separate conversation. It might make for an interesting conversation sometime. But let's point you back to the no more teachers, no more books, no more whatever's dirty looks, however that whole thing went. We have been asking folks about, and I think you covered it really, the Progressive Voters Guide, which we say is a pretty clear labeling of people, if you will. They are picking your opponent for a number of reasons, so that pretty much tells us where you're coming from. As we, the CRT or equity studies or whatever you call it, how would you define that? That has been, I think, the biggest bugaboo in education. Yeah. It's been so poo-pooed by the left as non-existent and a goofy idea, and it was in the legal community in the 50s or whatever, and blah, blah. A lot of folks see that as a continuation of the wokeness of our society and really an undermining approach to division in America. So let's get a working definition from you on that.
So CRT, which is critical race theory, also known as by its voting policy name in the Yakima School District Equity Studies, is not something actually new. 10 years ago, the school board passed something very similar in design, and it was supposed to implement and actually have surveys passed and improve minority issues or people of color, specifically is how they word it, and specifically in the Hispanic realm in our area. And that was 10 years ago, but it just kind of got swept under the rug, and they never did anything about it. It's more or less just a kind of a pound your chest moment. Look what we did for people of color. Look what we did for the Hispanic community. Look, and then do nothing at the end of the day.
Virtual signaling type of moment. Is that what you're
going? It's a virtue signal. They're proud of doing something, but really they're not doing anything. And it frustrates me more so than I think more people, because at the end of the day, when these people are talking about critical race theory, I'm a household that's bilingual. I'm a household that English isn't my wife's strong suit, and Spanish isn't my strong suit. And they're refugees here, and I'm going through the system currently to get my wife's citizenship. And it wasn't Republicans that made all these rules and regulations. It used to be you could get married and you could sign a few paperwork, give $500, and your spouse was now a citizen of the United States. That doesn't happen anymore. Now it costs a minimum of $5,000. So when I sit there and see all these people that don't have households that are mixed, that they're either all Hispanic households or they're all Caucasian households or they're all African households, and they're sitting there telling me about how we need to be more equal and everything like that, it's like, I'm the spitting image of what you're talking about, and you do nothing for us. You do nothing for the community. Like One America's out here doing all this stuff, all these lawsuits, but they do jack Sorry, they do jack nothing for the community. In fact, a lot of them are all lawyer activists that make $5,000 to $10,000 off illegal. They want illegals up here. Why? Because when you cross that border illegally, that means you're going to be paying at least $1,200 almost every 6 months to a year to get your paperwork, to get your visa through that person that advocated for you to come here, because they're making a ton of money off of doing a half a week's labor and the easy paperwork that they just rubber stamp.
I hear you. All right. So again, another subject that could be very interesting.
Yeah.
So we are at the 7:58 mark, Kenton. So people are tuning in by the thousands, and they're saying, "Who's this guy, and how does he differentiate from the incumbent? Why make a change? Why do we vote for Kenton Gartrell?"
So a vote for Kenton Gartrell is really quite simple. My campaign is the campaign of just saying no. And this time in Yakima, in the city of Yakima specifically, or the district of Yakima, it's critical race theory is on your doorstep as equitable studies. I'm a straight no. That doesn't belong in schools. And I'm the perfect example of what can say no to that, because you're talking about me, but it's insulting. And that's wrong. You're talking about my family. You're talking about my mixed household. The other thing is sex education. There is no reason outside of health or science we should be teaching anybody under the high school levels any type of a sexual education. I went to a private school in my lifetime. I had no sexual education whatsoever. It's not necessarily needed at the elementary or middle school level. You have there's 4 SBs that were on the House floor that everybody voted on. We're in the voting period last time. It's wrong. If you look at the education that they're implementing, there's no reason. It's child pornography, and that's wrong. You should not be teaching kindergartners, first graders, second graders, all the way up to 7th graders even. I would even argue you don't need it in the middle school level. Outside of its science and medical practices, why are you teaching it? There's no reason to teach this. That used to be the conversation of you and dad or you and mom.
It becomes personal family values instead the school has taken that over. All right, 30 seconds to go. Give us your best 15 seconds.
Best 15 seconds. Well, I'm a Republican. I'm a libertarian that sits in the Republican Party. A vote for me is a vote for a Republican. You could vote if you vote the other way, you're voting for a known Marxist that has implemented CRT, that has implemented these sex education. If you vote for me, I promise I will pound that table to try and dismantle those, defund those, and move to our values, which makes Yakima a very beautiful, loving family city.